It's a delight to introduce you to Melissa HarrisPerry.
Good morning. So it's the start of what is going to be an ideologically diverse day for me today. I'm going to run off the stage when I am done with my address because I am heading off to Chicago, where I will join the Bush family for a conversation about volunteerism in America. So that'll be fun. By the end of the day, I will have no idea what's going on in the world, but I am very happy to start the day with you, and particularly because what I find to be my value added within the public sphere is not as an activist or an organizer per se. I am married to an activist and an organizer, and so it's very clear to me which one of us does real work and which one of us talks about the real work that needs to get done in the world. And so that is probably not my comparative advantage. I hope today to do a little bit of what I think my comparative advantage is, which is to try to understand analytically where we are and how we got here. So I'm so appreciative of the framework of thinking about this within a historical context, the kind of robber baron moment. And I want to really take a much shorter historical context, really just the past decade. And rather than focusing primarily on what the elites have been up to think a little bit about how where we are now has been made possible by the choices that we, as ordinary citizens and Americans, made. Because we were not fully disempowered in these moments. We made many choices. So I want to start with the moment that is September 11th, 2001. Because I believe that the era that we are in now begins on September 11th, 2001. The election of George W. Bush in 2000, whatever we think about it, is an election that ultimately was a choice that the American people made about okay, that's not, okay. Okay, that's fine. That was all fine. I had a little, I've been reading The Hunger Games. I suddenly thought I needed to duck or something. Okay. I'm not even kidding. I really was running through my head what kind of thing the Capitol might have been sending to us in this moment. So September 11th, 2001, my sense here is that when we elected George W. Bush, or when George W. Bush was handed the American presidency by the Supreme Court of the United States, that decision was made in part because we understood ourselves to be in a time of peace internationally, of domestic economic growth, and George W. Bush, for whatever failings or successes he has, does seem like a guy to kind of keep the party going, right? So if you're thinking that you're coming out of the Clinton era and things are good economically and we're at peace internationally, then it does not seem that odd to make the choice of electing a kinder, gentler conservative, right? You got to go back to 2000 to remember where we were in that moment. We did not know then that just a few months into the first year of George W. Bush's presidency, that it would no longer be the good times, it would no longer be a time of economic expansion, it would no longer be a time of relative international peace, but instead that the new era would begin when Americans finally came into where many of our trading partners, political partners, and allies had been for decades, which is into the age of contemporary terrorism. Americans, of course, responded in very typically American ways to that entree into something that many people in the rest of the world had already experienced. We began with a kind of nationalist fervor that was justified as reasonable patriotism. I like to point out that we clearly must have been having post-traumatic stress disorder because for about a year after September 11th, there were African-American men walking around the city of New York with NYPD hats on. That can only be explained as a PTSD response. But I know, we'll just let you sit with that for a minute. But the other thing that happens in that moment, I don't want to miss this, is that a new version of what America typically needs emerged, and that is a racial enemy. Americans, in part, identify who we are and who deserves what through our notions of whiteness and of the racial enemies that are the non-whites. And in this moment, the new racial enemy became not so much Reagan's welfare queen, who was imaginary, but instead this imagined other that is somehow Muslim or Arab or Sikh or something else. We became willing to stomach a kind of horrific racial violence in the name of national security. It's something that we have been willing to stomach as a people over and over again in our history. The Patriot Act was not an act of a Republican president acting alone. The Patriot Act was a bipartisan decision by both parties. It was not bought and paid for by corporations. It was bought and paid for by our fear. As much as we have our eyes on the Citizens United decision, we have to remember that it was our collective angst, maybe not the people in this room, but our collective angst that gave permission to Democrats in the House to rally behind Republicans in the White House under the banner of nationalist patriotic security, with the goal of both reducing our domestic civil liberties and giving us an entrance into what is at this moment an everlasting war. We made those choices. So if that was September 11th, 2001, interesting thing happens a few years later. The Democrats need to run a presidential candidate. And it turns out Democrats are really very bad at one thing. Well, actually, a couple of things. But one thing in particular, and one of the things that we're very, very bad at, is trying to think about what kind of Democrat Republicans will vote for. Right? This is our predictive ability thing. It's really the only reason that we ended up with candidate Obama is because we were in an open seat race, and so we didn't really know who we were running against, so we just got all free with our actual preferences and ended up with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama as our final two. We never would have made those choices had we been running against an incumbent. We undoubtedly would have picked John Edwards. Let's just be honest about that. But in 2004, we chose what we thought would be the good moderate candidate, one that would get Republican votes, and that, of course, was John Kerry, who showed up at the 2004 DNC and saluted and said, "Reporting for duty." We did not, in the fall of 2004, launch as a Democratic Party an attempt to push back against the war effort. Quite the opposite. Democrats decided to run a soldier under the banner, under the idea that he could do even better at the war machine. So what changed that? What changed it? August 29th, 2005. August 29th, 2005 is the day that the levees failed in the city of New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Maybe it's actually not that day, because on that day and on the 5 subsequent days immediately after the levees failed and the city flooded, we behaved just as we did in the immediate post-9/11 moment. We got scared of our racial enemies. The governor of Louisiana, a Democrat, the mayor of the city of New Orleans, a black Democrat, jointly decided to suspend search and rescue efforts in order to focus on law and order. Until the national media recognized that there were people, not people actually, women, elderly, and children starving and dying in the city's center. It wasn't until the images of African American women, the elderly, and children who were dehydrating in the heat of a New Orleans August finally turned the language away from this kind of law and order language and into what the economists called the shaming of America. I don't know if you remember this, but I'm looking at the image right now that if I'd gotten myself together, I would have put up as a PowerPoint. But it's the image of The Economist magazine the second week of September 2005, an African-American woman is on the cover. She's wearing a New Orleans t-shirt, and it says, "The Shaming of America." I'd like you to pause and ask yourself, how many black women have appeared on the cover of The Economist magazine? And I don't know her name. I live in New Orleans, I study Katrina, and I don't know her name, and yet there are very, very few black women who ever have appeared. She may be, maybe Condi, ever, maybe. And yet the notion that there was still a collective shaming that happens in a country that fancies itself a place where women and children are first, Hurricane Katrina actually shames us into an anti-war stance. And here's how it goes. From September 11th, 2001 until about September 4th, I'm going to give it, of 2005, we are trying to participate in the nationalist patriotic fervor against the imagined racial enemy that is those others over there that are activating terrorism against us. Right until the levees fail, we realize that we've allowed our own citizens to drown, to die, and to dehydrate on camera. And we go, oh, if you can't get a water to an American city for a week, how can you prosecute a foreign war? And the Democratic Party feels a little steel drop down its spine. All these media folks who live in New York City who realize that if this is how we respond to disasters, they're screwed. And for the first time, we start hearing an active anti-war message, not from the people, but from the people that is then resonated up through a left party. This, of course, is how, in 2006, Democrats win back the House. They win the House in 2006 because for the first time, they articulate an actual paradigm difference to the Republican Party for the first time in 5 years. And we, of course, we remember the response to the anti-war message that won the midterm elections in 2006? You guys remember what happened? The surge, right? The response to the American people saying, we want out of the war, is that the White House sent more soldiers into the war. It is exactly the opposite of what happens in 2010 when, by taking over the House, the Republican Party decides that it has a mandate from the American people to turn back what they had just done in 2008. This White House in 2006 told us, we don't care what just happened in the midterms, we are running this war effort, and we let them. Except that, of course, we know what happened then right after that. It's a young guy. He was a state senator in Illinois. He'd managed to make it in to the U.S. Senate, really only because the Republican Party in Illinois was in such shambles that their decision for a candidate to run against him was Alan Keyes. And on a Wednesday, I could probably beat Alan Keyes for almost any race. Now, this is not to say that State Senator Barack Obama is anything short of exceptional, but the ease with which he walked into the U.S. Senate had everything to do with the failures of Judy Parr-Topinka and the Illinois Republican Party. Thanks, Judy. We appreciate that. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the national figure that emerges is Barack Obama on one hand, Hillary Clinton on the other, and a sense among the American people that what we had just done and what we had been doing since 2001 was not the best of who we were, that we were capable of something else. I loved the 2008 campaign. It was great fun. It just was, that 2008 campaign, great fun. But it wasn't great fun because the Obama for America campaign was so brilliant. They were fine. It was great fun because of the freelancing that went on. Remember, I'm trying to tell a story here about the people. Remember the freelancing that went on? So here Barack Obama goes and he does this amazing thing in New Hampshire. He loses and then gives a victory speech, which takes real gumption, right? He loses in New Hampshire and he's like, screw it. I'm going to give yes, we can anyway, right? Stands up and gives yes, we can. It's an amazing moment. Everyone's like, wow, that's hot. And then we walk away until a week later, and what happens? will.i.am remixes Yes, we can. When you think about why Yes, we can matters, it's not because of Barack Obama giving it, as great as it was. It's because will.i.am remixed it, and then you posted it on your Facebook wall, and then you sent it around, and then you emailed it, and then it became viral. The excitement of the 2008 campaign was the way in which freelancing and technology and ordinary people decided that what we had been doing since September 11, 2001 was no longer the best of who we were, and how the 2008 campaign might provide an opportunity for us to indicate the best of who we were, the exceptionalism that we defined as what made us exceptional, our willingness to think about either a white woman or a black guy, that's cool. The response from the right was a kind of anxiety about what that meant, a willingness to pull us back into what we had been doing for the years before. So that once President Obama is elected, the language is that he is a secret Muslim. Of course he's a secret Muslim, because remember, September 11, 2001, our new racial enemy becomes the Muslims. You know, of course, you can't be a secret Muslim. You can be a secret Christian, can't be a secret Muslim. It's just a different kind of religion. Like, you know, Christian, all you gotta do is be like, I love Jesus, he's in my heart, and then you can just be a Christian, and you can just do that secretly. But like, if you're a Muslim, there are certain kinds of practices that you have to do, so you can't like secretly be one. It's just not how it works. You would notice him praying 5 times a day. You cannot be a secret Muslim, okay? But along with that anxiety around this kind of secret outsider, and I'll go very quickly here, I promise, there's also a revival of the anti-immigrant panic. And we are as much on the left to blame for failing to recognize and stem this at the moment that it occurred. Do you remember the Joe Wilson moment? President Obama speaking, Joe Wilson stands up and says, "You lie." The left freaks out. It's racism. Black man speaking, white guy from former Confederate state says you lie, white black man speaking, that looks like ordinary old-fashioned racism. But don't forget this, President Obama, when he was speaking in that moment, was talking about the health care reform bill, and he said, when this passes, don't worry, illegals will not be allowed to partake in the health care reform that we are passing. And then Joe Wilson stood up and said, you lie. So the president was, in that moment, actually drawing a bright line, a boundary between citizens and non-citizens on this issue of a fundamental human right, healthcare reform, before Joe Wilson stands up and says you lie. So the terrain there is multiple levels. Yes, there's probably some of that old-fashioned Jim Crow racism, but there's also this brand new anti-immigration panic. Notice that this week, when the president was again interrupted by a journalist in the Rose Garden, that interruption came when he was talking about immigration. That laying on of our anxieties is about this new fear, this old fear, and mixed together with American racism. But then, of course, there's plenty of old-fashioned American racism going on still among us as people, again, not talking about the elites, but the shoot-to-kill laws that took Trayvon Martin's life are the same shoot-to-kill laws that were enacted in the days immediately following Hurricane Katrina, that are based in our same great fear that emerged immediately post-September 11th. This kind of vilification of bodies that we assume to be criminal. Lay on top of all of that, the war on women, a war on women that I noticed was occurring for the first, I wasn't sure it was coming, but I started seeing it when President Obama nominated Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court. If you can take yourself back and remember the gauntlet that she was forced to walk through those Senate confirmation hearings, like just for fun, for kicks and giggles this afternoon, watch the Jamie Dimon testimony right next to the Sonia Sotomayor confirmation hearings. Just watch them. Right after Sonia Sotomayor was put through what I like to call a kind of Elizabeth Eckford moment. Remember, Elizabeth Eckford is the girl, the teenage girl who was forced to walk that gauntlet in Little Rock with the screaming, yelling faces behind her, so much like what I saw when I was watching Sonia Sotomayor. Right after that, we then have the vilification of Shirley Sherrod. Now, I want to point out here, on this one, I'm not making a critique of the administration. I'm actually making a critique of the NAACP, an organization that I think has been doing extraordinary and exceptional work, especially recently, but who, in that moment, when Shirley Sherrod was first presented to the American people by Andrew Breitbart as a racist, the leadership of the NAACP initially, although they came around pretty quickly, but initially saying she should be ashamed of herself for her comments. Now, that had to have happened because they just didn't know who Shirley Sherrod was. And see, that's fine if you didn't know who Shirley Sherrod was. Maybe it's even okay if I don't know, although I did. But if you have ever watched Eyes on the Prize, which I assume anyone who is in the leadership of the NAACP did, then the name Sherrod and the state of Georgia should have sort of rung a bell for you because, you know, Charles Sherrod and Shirley Sherrod sort of liberated the rest of Georgia while King was taking care of Atlanta. But that willingness to see a rural black woman from Georgia as inherently expendable. And then, of course, post-2010, the full assault on women through the personhood amendments, through the fight between Komen and Planned Parenthood, through putting contraception on the agenda in the 21st century. Like, I'm sorry, it's horrible, but it really, you have to laugh. Like, seriously, we are talking about the pill in 2012. The outlawing of abortions that never actually occur, telling Sandra Fluke that she has to basically defend against being a slut in order to speak to the American people as though we are in Egypt and she has to submit to a virginity test in order to be in the public sphere. Oh yeah, and by the way, that 2010 year of the GOP woman is the first year that we actually lost ground in the US House of Representatives and Senate in terms of women's representation in more than 30 years. We did that. And when I say we, I just mean the American people in the broadest sense. That our fear, our anxiety, our willingness to frame others, whether they are unruly women, illegal immigrants, lazy black people, terrorist Muslims, our willingness to not see ourselves in them, but to see them as the other, make possible all of these policy moments. And this is the last thing I will say, and then I will run from this building. There is no reason to lose hope. We are just not a perfect people. We're just not. We're kind of like an adolescent country. We sort of, remember adolescence? My daughter is almost 11. I had forgotten. Adolescence is hard. You just randomly feel bad and get afraid and wonder about the security of childhood that you once had, and particularly for a country that became so dominant so quickly, that became so wealthy in the context of such inequality, that understood itself as standing on a shining hill. We are in our adolescence, and we're making a bit of a mess of it. That said, there is no reason to lose hope. The fear that has activated the past decade cannot be countered with more fear of what is coming. Is there money in the political system? Yup. Is the Supreme Court friendly? Nope. Are there folks willing to actually damage the very core of our democratic principles in order to win short-term gains? Mm-hmm. Are people going to yep. Maybe it's coming from people who were slaves and Mormons. My white people were Mormons. My black people were slaves. Everybody was basically after them. The Mormons got ejected out of Missouri and had to push handcarts across the American West. The black folks got enslaved for a couple of centuries. I don't know. I guess struggle doesn't worry me in the sense of being struggle itself. What I do know is that my enslaved grandmother, who was sold on a street corner in Richmond, Virginia, believed in God. Now, I'm not asking you to believe in God. I'm asking you to think about this. This is a woman who never knew anything but slavery for herself, never knew anything but slavery for everyone she'd ever been related to, never expected anything but slavery for all the people who she would be related to in the future. There was no empirical evidence that any being cared about her circumstances. There was no empirical evidence that there was a loving God that had any power. I mean, if there was a loving God, he was pretty pitiful. Or if he was powerful, he didn't seem to love her. I'm not asking you to believe in God or to accept any sort of supreme being. I'm asking you to think about the faith that is associated with a hope that is not necessarily rooted in the empirical realities that you see around you right at this moment, that says that we can still be part of something that is bigger than ourselves and something that we cannot necessarily see at this moment, but simply requires us not to be afraid of each other. Because it is our fear of each other. It's our fear of each other that makes us exceptionally easy to divide. And so I promise I'm leaving, but I will just say this. I know I talk to a lot, I really am. I'm going to go off and talk to the bushes now, but it's because I'm not afraid of them. Sometimes I'm angry with them. I often disagree, but I am not afraid of any person with whom we are struggling. We can get to another place. There's no reason to lose hope. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Melissa Harris.